Hi, everyone. So welcome to our post-screening discussion of Ai Weiwei's documentary film, Human Flow. We're going to have a virtual Ai Weiwei with us via video in a moment. And I want to thank you all for bearing with us. As you know, Ai Weiwei was scheduled to be here tonight, but he was unable to make it since all the flights from the East Coast were canceled. But we're very honored to have here with us the United Nations Commissioner General Karen Koning AbuZayd, one of the world's leading experts on the global refugee crisis. Commissioner General AbuZayd worked for the Office for United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, for 19 years, including as a special advisor to the United Nations Secretary General on the Global Summit on Refugees and Migrants, and as the chief of mission in Sarajevo during the Bosnian War, as well as positions in Sudan, Namibia, Sierra Leone, Geneva, and Washington, D.C. AbuZayd also served for 10 years as Deputy and then Under Secretary General and then Commissioner General of the United Nations Relief and Work Agency, also known as UNRWA, where she oversaw the emergency response and public services in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon for Palestinian refugees in the Near East. Currently, she is the Commissioner on the United Nations Geneva Human Rights Council's International Independent Commission on the Syrian Arab Republic. She's the former Special Advisor to the United Nations Secretary General on the Global Summit on Refugees and Migrants. And so we're very, very honored to have her here with us tonight to talk about the critical issues facing refugees worldwide and hopefully to tell us what we can do to help. So please join me in welcoming to the stage United Nations Commissioner General Karen Koning AbuZayd. So welcome, Commissioner AbuZayd.
Thank you.
So Ai Weiwei has sent us a message. Should we play that before we chat? Okay, let's go ahead and roll Ai Weiwei.
Hello, this is Ai Weiwei. I got stuck on JFK airport, so I cannot attend this film presentation. First, I'm very thankful for Hammer Museum and the audience come to for Human Flow. Today is very long day for me because we waited in the airport for a whole day. But you see, with these natural disasters like this, the whole airport, many airports, thousands flights are cancelled. But at the same time, we can see refugees stay in those camps in very cold weather, and there's not much protection, and they have no hope for the future. They have been refused, they have been blocked away to even to have not to seek comfort, but to have a safe place. And of course, we all know average refugees will spend about over 20 years, some 25 years. Some of them will spend 3 generations as refugees. And there's over 65 million of them. So refugee condition is human condition. I hope everybody can really be conscious about our world today. There's so much tragedies. The tragedies caused by war, also tragedies caused by natural disasters, climate change. You know, I just come back from Puerto Rico. Over 300,000 people have to move away. More than 50% of homes still have no electricity after 3 years of this hurricane. So you can see our situation is very fragile. And I hope everybody enjoys the film. I feel sorry I cannot be here. And I thank you for coming to the theater.
tried. But I'm really, really thrilled to have Commissioner General AbuZayd here. So of all the scenarios represented in the film, which of them is likely to change next? I mean, it's all happening so incredibly quickly.
I think that it's very difficult to say. There are some that are older than others and are no longer occurring. You've cleaned up some of parts of Europe, as you've seen, and people have been able to move on. On the other hand, there are many of them that are still going on, and people are still in the same condition as Ai Weiwei has mentioned, and they'll be that way for some time. No matter how many efforts are made by international organizations and individuals and so on, there just isn't a solution everywhere. I think one of the things to look at that the film brings out that we don't often think of is the host communities, because what we have is 80% of the refugees are in the so-called developing or the third world. They're in places where the people themselves have many difficulties, and so you see why there's resistance to helping the refugees or welcoming them and so on. And that's what we need to try to convince the world more of, that we've got to share this. We've got to share and that's why we're so disturbed, I would say, about when the intake for refugees is reduced, as we've seen in this last year and now this year in America, because we had just been beginning to hope that the quota for refugees coming into the United States was going to go up last year to 85,000, and now it's gone down to 25,000 instead. We'd had some promises from the last president, and so we're really worried about that.
In contrast to the Canadian situation, you were telling me backstage about this special program in Canada. Can you describe that to us?
Yes, this is something we like to talk about all the time. I don't know if any of you know about it or are anybody from Canada, but the Canadians really deserve a huge, big medal. They have a program of family sponsorship. And last year when we had a big problem with the Syrians and so many and so on, we got 24,000 out of Syria, or out of the refugee camps around Syria, to go into Canada to be sponsored, each family by another family, by a Canadian family. And the Canadians have more families signed up to ask to help a refugee family than they have refugees coming into Canada. And they have large numbers coming in every year. So we'd like to use that as an example for other countries.
I wish we could do something like that here in our sanctuary state as of Monday of California. It would be really incredible if we could provide sanctuary for some of these refugees. In 2016, the United States created a historic declaration for refugees and migrants in which all 193 member states of the United Nations agreed that protecting those who are forced to flee their countries are shared international responsibilities. And I believe you were one of the leading forces in creating this declaration. Can you tell us more about it and what its purpose is?
Well, I was the special advisor to the Secretary General, had a very small team that worked with me, and we created what became the New York Declaration for Refugees. I recommended the two compacts we've heard maybe about, a compact for migration and a compact for refugees, and these things are still being worked on. They will be launched next year. They're going on right this year. There's things happening for them, and that's one reason one of our people was not going to be here with us, Louise Arbour, who is going to be she's the international representative of the Secretary General for International Migration. What was so exciting, I would say, was that on the 31st of July, which is the day before all ambassadors go on holiday for August, we were still negotiating the compact, what became the New York Declaration. And we had just some resistance from only one nation, and that was our own, our American nation. There was one thing they would not agree to, was that children should never be in detention, which all other 192 nations had signed up to. They were given the opportunity to, we did already weaken it. We started out with children should never be in detention. We went down to say children should seldom, if ever, be in detention, which sounds very weak, but at least it was there. They wouldn't even agree to that. So the brilliant ambassador who was leading the negotiations, an Irishman, he said, I'm going to give you, the person who was representing the United States then, the deputy ambassador, he said, I'll give you a chance. You go all around the room and negotiate, and if you find even one nation who agrees with you, we will open the negotiations, and you know what that will mean. We'll get to stay here for some few weeks. Well, she went all around, and the Americans had not, there were many groups that negotiated from January up until September. And they were, geographic groups and thematic groups and so on. The Americans were never part of any one of them. It was very embarrassing to be an American leading this, and we couldn't get the Americans to do the little simple things that needed to be done. She couldn't get anyone to, well, we didn't know. She came up on the podium and she whispered in the ear of the ambassador. He said, very good, that's it. And he just gabbled it. It became then the New York Declaration that was adopted in September then by all 193 states. And as you may have known, that we had, after the day that we adopted this declaration, the following day there was a whole day worth of the American-led, Obama-led negotiations as well. And I was the lucky one who was the fourth in the line after the Secretary General, and I missed all the evening events because I had to stay till the end of going through all of the declarations that were made by all the nations offering things toward the Obama Declaration, which was the Declaration for Refugees. And we went down until 9:30 at night, where every nation had something to offer, either a resettlement place or even a bit of money or anything that they could say. It was a very inspiring, very tiring event that second day. So there were 2 days in a row that were good for refugees and migrants. Now we just have to see if what was promised then actually is carried out by all of our states. So we're one of the outliers once again now with our the latest election that we had.
So I know not everyone watching this on the video live stream will be from the United States, but for the Americans here today, what can Americans do if they want to support the cause of refugees, and how can we help?
Well, I think it would be nice if people could perhaps persuade their own communities to welcome refugees. And even if they say, let us take 10 families or let us take 3 families and we'd be willing to help them, you begin to have this idea that people can share. And if people could see more nations act like Canada and welcome people there. And we should give credit to the Europeans that have. I mean, the Germans welcomed 1 million last year. We heard that in the film. I mean, Angela Merkel is a real hero. She's just something quite special. And she's, of course, paid a price for that. She's still in power, but not easily. So I think we have to consider the political problems that leaders have when they take these bold advances and so on, and there are of course people who don't understand and don't really want foreigners and don't want people who are different from them. So the more we can do, if we are different, to try to show people how it is that we can get along, and how much it enriches us to the diversity when we engage with one another and learn other people's language and other people's customs and exchange the way we eat food and so on. And I think people who finally enjoy these things will then be able to convince others, and maybe it will spread a bit.
So as an expert working in the field of refugees, what do you think of this film? Do you think it has an impact?
I'd like to hear from the audience about that. As I mentioned earlier, I think it has several messages. It has the one of how horrible it is for people who can't stay where they are, who are forced to leave. No refugee, no person in the world wants to leave his home. They don't go because they want to, they go because they have to. And that's why we call this whole phenomenon forced displacement now. And that's mainly for refugees, but it's also for some migrants as well. So people only go because they have to. But this film shows, I think it shows, when I said something earlier about its being beautiful, and I always wondered afterwards why I thought this film was beautiful, it's because it also shows people the strength of their movements and their willingness and their helpfulness to each other, and that although it's very distressing what they're going through and there are big problems, many of them come out well on the other side. And I think that it shows that that interrelationship among different sorts of people, and it helps, I think. And I think the film, I mentioned in the idea of the flow, because it is a flow and it's not going to stop. It may be slowed down, it'll be speeded up, but it's inexorable. People will move. That's what we do as people and what we've done for centuries. And so I think we have to accept that and learn how to not accept it, but to welcome it and see how we deal with it and how we help the people who move. Because often, I mean, Angela Merkel was the one who will say that, especially in Europe. I don't know that it's so much different here, but somewhat. They need refugees, they need migrants, they need young people, they need people with skills or people who are willing to do jobs that maybe we aren't willing to do so much anymore. So give them a chance and see how they contribute to your country, because that's what they will do, because they'll be very hardworking. They'll be so glad to be accepted somewhere. And that's what I think people see when they get to know people who are moving, who are refugees and migrants, that they are a real asset to the countries in which they settle.
Well, I was thinking as I watched the film, and knowing, of course, that Ai Weiwei is from China, about the giant migration happening right now in China, where I think 10 million people are moving from rural areas into cities in a 10-year period. And it's said to be the largest migration of human populations ever. And you mentioned that the declaration that you worked on in New York separates migrants from refugees. And I don't think that those two distinctions are that clear to everybody. Maybe you want to emphasize how you see those?
Yeah. A refugee, as you saw the definition up there, is someone fleeing persecution or conflict or unrest, whatever. So that's why we call them forced. Some people like to call them migrants too, but they would be the forced migrants. Migrants generally we see, and I think many people migrants themselves would consider themselves migrants even if they're forced, but migrants also are people who have a choice, who decide to leave, who often leave under legal terms, under contracts, and they go somewhere for so many years and often then stay on or whatever. But so they're two different groups. So the refugee is subject to some sort of persecution, even if it's the weather. But mostly it started out as political persecution and conflicts and war and that sort of thing.
So speaking of weather, Ai Weiwei mentioned the situation obviously right now on the East Coast, but in Puerto Rico recently, we had Houston flooded, obviously New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina. How much do you see climate change as being part of these shifting populations?
It's a huge part now, more and more every year, I think, right now we're seeing. I heard some good things on the radio today and on television where people were, again, insisting about the Puerto Ricans who are American citizens, and we are not helping them at all. They're up to this terrible tragedy they've been through and still have no electricity, still have no water, and we are not pouring any money into there or trying to take any of them away for a while, at least, while their place can be rebuilt. It's something to think about carefully. And one other thing that hasn't come up, maybe, and I think these are, but it relates to the question of people, for example, in China moving internally, is a group that is totally neglected, are the internally displaced persons, people who are having to move in their own countries for various reasons, like the Rohingya, who are now in Bangladesh, so they've become refugees, but there are many who are still inside Myanmar. These are people who are really, really stuck because the reason for their moving is their own government in the most places, the policies of their government that discriminates against them. And, at least refugees have, some legal things behind them, and migrants are the same. But internally displaced person, they have no recourse. They have no one to go to help them.
Can you imagine a time where the United States, you might see these long marches of people migrating, or huge populations living for years and years and years in tent camps?
I can't. I hope you can't either. I hope that won't happen here. If we get close to it by doing it to people who are really part of us, like the Puerto Ricans, I suppose it is possible. But I think there's too much goodness in America, and too many people who would just not let that happen. Like all of you who are here watching this film, I think you came for a reason, and maybe you've even become more enthusiastic to try to help refugees and migrants after seeing this film.
Well, I hope you're right. I know that President Trump recently discontinued the status of Haitian immigrants to the United States, and that is predicted to end up forcing those people to leave, either to go back to Haiti or go to Canada. I thought that was an absolutely despicable act, but...
and tens of thousands of them that he has identified, I think, you know.
It's shocking. And then, you know, there was a lot of footage pretty recently of people who had come to the United States as refugees who were then being kicked out, going to Canada. And I don't know if you remember those images
Yes.
of the Canadian Mounties helping them across the river to enter Canada. But
Yeah, they weren't kicked out, they went rushing to Canada as soon as they had this problem, yeah. But this is true. These are the dreamers, of course, DACA that we're talking about. These are the children who came with their parents when they were young and had some status for a while, or still do have some, but are going to lose that, we think, unless we can fight it more. And I think those of you who are politically active or who aren't, but who could become, I mean, these are things that we should really fight against. These are people who really deserve a chance. You know, they're in school, they're working, and so on, and just because they don't have that right paper, they might be sent away.
yeah, I'm proud of the state of California for being a sanctuary state, and I'm proud of being part of University of California, which is also providing sanctuary to DACA students here, many of whom work here at the Hammer Museum. So we really want to support them as much as possible. So just briefly, I mean, it's hard to say this briefly, but your entire professional life, over 40 years, has been spent working with refugees. Can you just describe for us a little bit about what populations you worked with and what that was like and what you did with them, or what you are doing with them?
Yeah, now I've sort of moved, when I retired from the UN officially, I went into the human rights work, this is pro bono work that we do with the Human Rights Council. It's mostly retired people or professors who have time and so on, and we don't want to take jobs from someone who needs them, so we accept this part-time pro bono work. So that's what I do now in these human rights works with refugees. But for the 40 years before that, I was lucky that I spent 8 years in my home country, which was then Sudan. My husband was from Sudan. And I was teaching at the University of Juba, which he was the vice chancellor of, and we had started as the end of the South Sudan and North Sudan civil war, with a university that was both North and South students and professors. It was a wonderful experience, and we're very sad to see what has happened now in South Sudan, because it was a really exciting adventure. So then I worked in Sudan for 8 years, which is unusual in UNHCR because you have to rotate after every couple of years. But because I was put in the office of the Sudanese Refugee Council, and there were 1 million refugees coming into Sudan at the time, from Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Chad, plus Southern Sudanese coming back. So there was a big job to do, and there was a lot of money being poured into Sudan. And so I had been working, helping to send Ethiopian and Eritrean refugees to American University in Cairo. That's how I started with UNHCR in Sudan. And so they thought, well, you know, you're very acceptable to the Sudanese. You can go work in the Sudanese Council of Refugees. And so I was very lucky to spend 8 years working there while my children were growing up. And so I didn't have to run off. And like many people who work in the UN have problems when their families are growing up, their children are in high school, and they need to stay somewhere for 4 years at least. And they have to make really unusual arrangements. So I was lucky with that. But then finally UNHCR said, you've had enough, it's time to move, and they sent me to Namibia for the repatriation. And I think I've mentioned that these are the happiest refugee situations to be involved in. You're taking people home. People are glad to come home. the host country is glad that the people are leaving, the refugees, and the original home country is glad to have their people back. So I was lucky to do that for some time. But then Liberians began to come into Sierra Leone, so they asked me to go there, which was wonderful because I love the heat. I love hot countries. And so I went to live in Sierra Leone, and we had 100,000 Liberians coming into Sierra Leone over the border mostly at once. Sierra Leone has, and almost still has, almost no infrastructure, no trucks, no nothing. So there was no way to move. We were trying to build camps near the capital, but there was no way to get the people there. So we put the 100,000 refugees in 600 villages along the border of Sierra Leone, and they were welcome. We built a well, we brought in food, and so the people welcomed them, and they were there until the civil war started in Sierra Leone. And then the refugees said, hey, we've just come from our own civil war. We don't want to be here. We want to go home or go somewhere else. So there was no way for them to go home yet. So we actually walked them across the country. They very willingly walked across the country to go to the refugee camp that we had built in the capital of Sierra Leone. So that was, we had trucks and, didn't have trucks. We had some buses that we took along, and if people were ill or old, we would help them get there. But they were very obliging. The Liberians are very, very fun kind of people who make a game of everything, and they did well. We were lucky. We worked with the American Red Cross to do that. Then they wanted to go home, and my headquarters was very reluctant about that because there was still trouble in Liberia, but these people said, look, we might as well go home. We don't need to be here in a situation. We might as well be home in this kind of situation. So we kind of were lucky because Sierra Leone was, the electricity wasn't good, the computers weren't always working, couldn't get us on telephone. So we thought we had to just go ahead and help these people go home. So we used our budget to let people who volunteered to go home, they signed up as voluntary repatriation, and we let them go on boats and go home, and they all did very well back home too, so we were able to follow that. I spent some time in Geneva. Those were the least favorite times when you're in the headquarters and not out in the field. I managed to get away, as was mentioned, to go to Sarajevo during the war. And that was a very interesting thing for our for UNHCR, and I was the chief of mission in Sarajevo for the Bosnian side of that war. And what we were working with were not refugees. We weren't even working with displaced persons, which we were able to do in some places along with working with refugees. But we were working with just Bosnians who were war deprived, and we were bringing in food for 4 million people, and we had an airlift, took the food out in Sarajevo, and then trucked it around the whole country. And it was, I had to be spending a lot of time with ICRC because they were the ones that usually did this sort of work. But one of their senior men had been killed at the beginning of the war, so they had withdrawn.
That's
and
the
UNHCR
International Red
took over,
Cross.
the International Committee of the Red Cross. So we temporarily took that over, and it was extremely interesting to do something quite different and a bit different from what UNHCR usually does.
Did you do the same in Syria, distributing food to the existing population on the ground during the war? You worked in Syria as well, right? Where you are working with Syria.
Yeah. Well, no, I only worked in Syria through when I was with UNRWA. I mean, I spent some time in Geneva, and then I spent some time in Washington for 2 years. That wasn't my favorite place either, because I spent a lot of time trying to raise money and being up on the hill and convincing people to support the refugees. But that was the job, and for that, it worked very well. I'm not sure if it's going to work now. This year, we've heard some bad news that the money from UNRWA might be withdrawn, which would be just devastating. And I think the Israelis will help us very much to get the money, will help UNRWA to get that money that they need from the United States, because otherwise they will have to take over and shoulder the burden of keeping the refugees alive in Gaza particularly. So that's but no, the work I do now is just is with interviewing refugees in refugee camps, Syrian refugees, to record what has happened to them, so that we make these reports 3 times a year in Geneva on the violations and abuses. We're the longest standing commission of inquiry, because usually these commissions of inquiry work for a couple of years and then the struggle is over that they're looking at. This one has gone on since 2011, has no sign of stopping, or at least getting any better. It'll be a long time before the country can repair itself, can get back together. It probably will never be as wonderful as it was before. It was a very special country, very tolerant, very secular, and full of history and craftsmanship and well-educated people and nice people. It was a very pleasant place. I say I had 30,000 staff when I worked for UNRWA in all the 5 countries where the Palestine refugees are, and all of them, if they had holidays, went to Syria for the holidays.
And you lived in Gaza for 10 years, right?
And I lived in Gaza for 10 years.
What was that like?
That was wonderful. Again, we lived on the sea. That was nice, and it was warm most of the time. But also, we worked very well with the Israelis, who had to agree on every calorie that went into Gaza. So not just the food, but all the things that kept them alive that's not doing so well right now because they're not getting their electricity and water that they need. But all the supplies that came in, and we had to negotiate all of those things. And of course, our work with Palestine refugees is mainly with the schools and the health system and so on. So we ran all the education for the refugees, and the refugees were 80% of the population of Gaza. So we were feeding about 1.8 million people there, to bringing the food in for those people. And it's very rewarding. I mean, the Palestinians are wonderful people too. They're very easy to work with. They're very friendly and very good at helping themselves as well. And no matter how bad things get, they still carry on. So
I have to say, you're so incredibly inspiring. And I even went on the United Nations website last night, and I was amazed to find out that you can volunteer and be in the field as a volunteer with the United Nations for 3 to 6 month periods of time. So that's something that some of you might want to consider doing sometime.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and there are many different agencies with different kinds of skills and needed and so on. You need interpreters. You need journalists. You need scientists. The World Health Organization has just advertised some very interesting jobs for people that have interested in medical field, particularly.
It's amazing. Okay, I think we have time for a few audience questions.
Yeah,
so I have ushers in the aisles who will bring microphones to people. Does anybody have any questions they want to ask?
Or statements you'd like to make? Yeah.
Not too long statements, hopefully, if anybody has. No questions? Oh, there's a question right there. I'm sorry, please wait for the microphone.
Yeah, I have a question and then a brief comment after it. My question is focusing on prevention. What we're seeing in the film is the end of the flow, this terrible stream, and we're trying to kind of rescue people. But there are forces which are pushing this stream, and I'd be interested in your thoughts about those forces and what can be done from the prevention aspect. I'm a pediatrician, and I've seen an awful lot, and I know that preventing things is much better than trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. The other thing, brief comment, we have had forced migrations in this country. To name some that come to my mind, there's the Cherokee Trail of Tears, there's the Dust Bowl in the 30s, there's the migration of African Americans from the prejudice of the South to the North. And the Japanese were here in California and in the West were put literally in concentration camps, albeit not a la the Nazis, but we have had that. And I think we're at risk for it again at some point if we're not very careful.
Taken.
Yeah, we're not innocent, but I think we've learned, I thought we'd learned anyway, and become better at doing the right thing. Many of these things you've mentioned are at least some decades old, not all of them. But it is something that we do need to remember about our own past. Yes, it's true.
What
can be
prevention?
done?
Prevention.
What's the prevention? The problem is, of course, is that until now it's mainly political. That's why I said that we can be palliative in welcoming refugees in our communities, for example, or volunteering to show refugees around when they're brought into our communities and things, making them feel welcome. Learning their language maybe, or helping them learn English, that sort of thing is very important. But how we prevent what's going on around the world today is it's beyond what I am able to give advice about. I think we have to, if we have ideas that or we know what should be done, which we often do personally, is to make that known to our politicians that that's where we want them to go, and encourage them to discuss with other leaders around the world. I think that's where you have, because you have some very good leaders, and following their lead is what we could do.
Another question? I think maybe we have one right there.
My question is, how do I word it? How do you feel about artists engaging in this political dialogue? Like, do you think that artists have a certain authorship, or like, do you think they're qualified enough to create work like this?
Well, we've just seen what Weiwei could do. And I think artists and people in that community are often well-known people or admired people for various reasons. And if they can make the point that we need to help refugees, or we need to solve certain political problems somewhere, I think it often makes a difference because people will listen to them. They have a voice. So yeah, I'm very much in favor of anybody who's willing to speak out. But if people who have a reputation that people are going to listen to, all the more important that they're the ones giving out the messages.
Another question? There's a question right there.
Tonight's been fascinating, and I can't help but think that I just came back from being in Estonia. And in Estonia, as in the New Yorker just published last week, they're leading with e-residency. So they're opening their four walls to anybody who wants to be an e-resident of Estonia. And I can't help but put that and juxtapose that to watching this, and whether it's refugee migration, forced migration, or diluting a culture. Many countries are looking at this model, and while they're 3 years in and they still have to solve it, other countries are looking at this. So what does that look like in the next 5 years and 10 years?
That's a
Could
great
you explain
example.
to us what that means?
No, I don't know. I don't know about
Oh.
it, but that sounds wonderful.
What is e-residency?
So anybody can be a resident of Estonia today. And the question would really come back to the United States of what does that mean to be an American citizen and also hold an e-residency, where you would have voting rights, pay your taxes. And it's something that I just learned about while I was speaking there at a tech festival. So it's news to me, but I see a lot of people in the film industry looking to do cross-collaboration. Maybe if you're in a country like Turkey that doesn't take PayPal, you could become an e-resident and set up your business in Estonia. Or if you're a female that can't have a company, then you could have it in Estonia. Mm-hmm. So it's a sort of fascinating model to look at now, and what that's going to be in the next so many years.
What a good idea. You know, people are going to have dual citizenship, so, you know, they can do that if they like.
I have another question back there.
Yeah, it's a mix of comment and question. I noticed and was really enjoying in the film how, you know, just the sheer his usage of color, of everything from in the background and how, you know, just how individual people, the way he did it, you continually saw people not in a group identity, but they were in a common situation, but you could see their individuality. With one repeated exception, and I'm wondering your understanding of Africa, if you could speak to the cultural tradition of those that were always clad in the white. Is that common? Is that what they're always wearing, where they would be in their homeland? Were they given these outfits as an alternative to that they had no clothes? One of them seemed very much more of a cultural expression, and the other one seemed like a zip suit, but it really diminished your ability. It reduced for at least myself, the ability to see them more individually. And I'm wondering if you could illuminate on any of that.
Yeah, that struck me in the film too. And I think they were just protecting them. They were getting on the boats, and so they were putting them into something that was warmer and waterproof. That's all. But it was kind of an unfortunate image, wasn't it? Yeah. Well, but that is a problem of the numbers of Africans who are coming into Europe and have been trafficked themselves, dying in the desert as they go through the Niger-Libyan route, and then you have the Turkey EU agreement, which isn't very nice either. We're being paid to keep the people or to take them back. And now there's certainly a lot going on to stop the Libyan exodus through Libya or through Niger. So, something we're having to deal with.
Okay, we have another question right here.
Hi. In the film, there was one camp that they had mentioned that had developed its own economy.
Where?
I don't remember where it was, and I don't know if anyone else does, but it didn't really say.
In the film.
Yeah. And I'm just wondering if you can speak a little more on that and how some camps seemed to, they had what was it, a football field or, a soccer field, and then, just some camps seem to be doing better. Or then also other situations where the refugees are integrating into the society and how that's worked as well.
Does anybody know the name of where the camp was? What?
Yeah.
Dadaab?
Dadaab? Kenya. No, I think it was
Syrian
the Syrians
camp
in
in Turkey.
No, Turkey. Yeah, Turkey was another hero when the refugees were first coming in. They immediately had camps that were made with container camps where people had water, hot water, electricity, and they were feeding them. They were bringing hot meals to every one of those containers for months. But then they let the refugees. So it depends on the host community, again, the government, how much they allow the refugees to do. Because the refugees, that's what you can see from this, is that they're seeking shelter, safety, and when they get it, then they're very independent and they want to make their way and so on. And they're wonderful. They set up markets, they exchange things, and that's what they've been able to do in Turkey and somewhat in some of the other countries. And Lebanon is another hero of a country. It's a 4 million people with 2 million refugees. They said a third. It's really more than that. And they don't have any camps. It's not that they have the people tucked away and taken care of easily. They're all over, and they really have, it's not easy, and nobody is too happy about it, and the refugees themselves don't do very well, but they are permitted to be there, they're permitted to work, and they're permitted to earn their way, and I think the Lebanese deserve a lot of credit for that, too.
I think we actually need to wrap up for the evening, but before we close, on behalf of the Hammer Museum, I want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us tonight, and I want to invite you all to our big exhibition opening on Saturday, January 27th from 8 p.m. to 11 p.m., and you can visit the Hammer website for more details. And please join me in giving a very, very warm thank you to the United Nations Commissioner General Karen AbuZayd for joining us here tonight. Thank you.